Hey, everybody. Can you believe it? It's the last of our period reviews for 2020. So, this is the last of our horizontal reviews. Next week, we will start into the vertical reviews. Obviously, this year, with the whole Rona thing, we are only doing up to period 7 on the test. So, that's all we're going to do in these reviews. So, without further delay, let's talk about period 7. So, period 7, when we think about what it means to be an American, the identity of Americans. In this period, starting in 1890, going through to 1945, new European immigrants are not considered American when they get here. So Italian Americans, Polish Americans, Hungarian Americans, Greek Americans, they are seen as something other than American and other than white. Okay, it's a separate category for these people. But we get through the First World War, and a lot of people from those groups contribute to victory in the First World War, especially on the home front in the factories. They start getting elected to offices in cities by the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s. And by the time we reach 1945, September 1945, Italians are white people. And I know how insane that sentence sounds. But as we discussed in class, whiteness doesn't really have to do with skin color so much as it does a set of societal expectations and rules. So we have this incredible 50-year period where this whole group of people are not really seen as American, not really seen as white, and then suddenly they are kind of brought into this status, if that's what we're going to call it. The United States is a new world power, and Americans start seeing themselves as part of this world power. We're the best in the world. We're the ones who tell the world what to do. That becomes an American attitude in this period, whereas it had not been before. We also have, on account of the war and the New Deal and the Great Depression, the federal government is part of people's everyday lives for really the first time in American history. Most people never had interaction with the federal government at any level until we get to the New Deal. And then you've got Social Security, you've got the peacetime draft, you've got all these work programs, price restrictions, wage restrictions, et cetera, et cetera. And the federal government really starts getting involved in the lives of everyday people, at first during extraordinary circumstances, and then pretty much more regularly after that. Politics. Woodrow Wilson is the first Democrat to win power in a long time in 1912. Remember that whole period from Abraham Lincoln in 1860 to 1900, you had one Democrat elected, and that was Grover Cleveland, who had those 2 non-consecutive terms, and then Woodrow Wilson comes in 1912. So if you think of this period of 52 years with only 2 different Democratic presidents elected, that's a long period of Republican rule. Then you get another 20 years of Republican rule after that, and then Franklin Roosevelt. So another way to think about this is that between April of 1860 and April of 1945, there were only 3 Democratic presidents. So what does that mean? It means, number one, hard to blame a lot of problems on the Democrats when they did not hold the presidency for a very long time. Other than the 2 terms of Cleveland, the 2 terms of Wilson, and then the 4 terms of FDR, they are still 3 people. This whole era is really one of Republican domination for good and ill. So that's kind of the first big political thing. The other massive political implication that happens during this time is women's suffrage with the 19th Amendment in 1920. An enormous deal. That's 50%, a 50% increase in the number of eligible voters, and that's a really big deal. For African Americans, it's a less big deal in this period. In the next period, obviously, it becomes a bigger deal when we get to the Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act. But African Americans still segregated, still not allowed to vote, still not allowed to participate in public life. But when they come back from World War II, because many, many African Americans serve in the Second World War, they're ready to fight for civil rights. And World War II, in so many ways, is going to supercharge a civil rights movement that already had existed for quite some time. When we think about business and stuff, this is a huge era of production and innovation. Think about the difference between the world in 1890 and the world in 1945. 1890, the only real motorized method of transportation was the railroad. By 1945, you have V2 rockets. In 1890, the only way to get in the air was in a balloon. Again, you have the beginnings of the space program by 1945. That's an enormous change in 55 years. You have the automobile. It goes from something people couldn't imagine to something virtually every family has by 1945. Electricity, something that almost nobody had, to something that almost everyone has. It's insane how much people's lives change because of technology in that era. And perhaps there's no other era with that kind of change unless you think about the era we're living in right now. And I think we're too close to that to really make that call. Laissez-faire economics. So we know this had been the policy of the United States government since really the late 1880s. The government keeps its hands off of the economy. And that is going to continue for 40 years leading, or 50 years leading, right up to the stock market crash and the Great Depression. And at the end of Hoover's term in 32, for the first time ever, we really see laissez-faire take a backseat in American economics. The New Deal starts to end the Depression. World War II is what really ends the Depression, with full employment and lots of consumer goods, and you build up savings again. And then we move from, 1890 is really the beginning of massive industrialization in this country, to then the post-war boom that's going to happen in the United States after 1945. There's going to be a brief recession in 45 when factories stop making all these war goods, but then the economy is really going to be incredibly well managed throughout the rest of the 40s and 50s and into the 60s, with really an unparalleled economic boom in American history. Okay, culturally, we have this backlash to minorities and immigrants. You have the second Ku Klux Klan that we had talked about in the 1920s, and how they're coming for immigrants and African-American people. So all these Catholic and Jewish immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, they are coming for the African-American people moving into cities after the Great Migration, which we'll talk about in a minute. You have the flowering of American culture with the Lost Generation, those writers that we talked about from the 1920s, and the jazz movement that's, coming with African Americans through the Great Migration into our big cities. And jazz is going to become really the first truly American musical art form. In migration, we have this huge wave of immigration from 1890 to 1924, with over 1 million immigrants coming to America every year until 1924. And remember that in 1924, you have that Immigration Act that just shuts off immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. And that's really one of the things that just supercharges the Great Migration of African-American Southerners to cities in the North. When factories can no longer get cheap European workers from overseas, they're going to get cheap African-American workers from the American South. And that's obviously an enormous deal for Toledo, Ohio. It's really what made our city today. It's what made our city great today. Technology and stuff. New technology makes the world a smaller place. In 1890, it would be impossible to think that you could know what was happening in Britain right now. And yet that's going to be immediate, right? Through radio broadcasts, through telegrams and telephones. Technology is making the world a smaller place. You can get from New York to London in 12 hours, whereas that used to be a 12-day voyage across the Atlantic. These are enormous changes, making the whole world a smaller place. And we start realizing that what happens on one side of the planet affects what happens in the United States. We have the beginnings of the conservation movement with Teddy Roosevelt and the progressives, where they're saying we can't allow every resource to be tapped. We have to set aside some places as being too special to exploit for the resources that we need for industrialization. In the United States, we tend to believe that the ocean shields us from war. We had always been really unanxious to get involved in Europe's wars, because what does it matter to us? We got two oceans that protect us from getting invaded. And then that kind of stops being true in World War II. We start realizing that with missiles and atomic weapons, we are no longer protected the way we once were. The development of the atomic bomb is obviously just a massive change point in American history. Finally, when we look at foreign relations, this period gives us three of the larger foreign conflicts in American history to that point. First, you have the Spanish-American War, which we had talked a lot about as a result of imperialism. Then the Spanish-American War is over. We have imperial possessions. World War I breaks out. We get involved very hesitantly at the end, but it starts making us a global power, and we retreat from that. We have this isolationism in the 1920s and 30s, where the American people want nothing to do with the rest of the world because we have so many problems of our own to deal with at home. And that leads World War II to become somewhat worse because Hitler, Mussolini, the Japanese, they keep expanding while everybody's saying it's not our problem. And by the time we actually get involved, it's an enormous problem and much more difficult to deal with. The aftermath of World War II, from the Holocaust to the Cold War, leads the United States to commit to intervention. We decide we had better be involved in the world. If we're not, somebody else will. So that, my friends, kind of wraps up our final period, our final horizontal review. I will be back with you soon. If you're watching this at the time I'm making these, I'll be back with you next week and we'll start in on the vertical reviews. Thanks a lot for paying attention to this, and take care. Bye.